I know, that's exactly what you're thinking, right? That's a hip-hop dancer. Right there. I love movement, and I love connection. I love the fact that when I was shaking people's hands, that I saw a lot of the words community bringing you joy, connection bringing you joy. That really brought me a lot of joy. That's one of my, well, it's my line of work in resilience for the last 20 years, is studying what creates a resilient person. And I want to share with you, I'm going to get really just down real with you right away, because that's just how I roll. But I want to talk to you about a little interaction I had earlier this week, where I was meeting with someone about the business that I do in workplace wellness, and I got right down to business. Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. Shake the hand. Boom. Right into business. And he stopped me right in the middle of a sentence and said, I feel really disconnected from you right now. And I was a little taken back. I mean, I know this person. We didn't need to shoot the breeze for 20 minutes, get to know each other. I mean, this is a friend. And he said, I want you to stop and I want you to think, what brings you joy? And I thought, well, I love bringing people together. I love events. And then I started to explain why I love to do events. And he stopped me again and he said, why do you feel the need to explain yourself? Because now I feel disconnected from you again. I feel like I'm being sold something. Like, well, you are. And he said, I want you to think about what's underneath your reasoning to have to explain yourself. He's an emotional wellness coach. Don't ever meet with an emotional wellness coach. And you know, in that moment, we're in the middle of Starbucks, in a very, very busy Starbucks. I get tears in my eyes because I started going deep in myself, in the presence of someone else, looking me in the eye and not letting me off the hook, feeling fully seen in that moment. And I said, I've never really felt heard. And in fact, I don't even know if I deserve to be successful. And he's like, that's it right there. And he held space for me. He didn't let me off the hook, and I'm so glad. It was the most uncomfortable moment because I wanted to prove myself right there. I wanted to show him that I had something valuable to offer. I wanted to explain the excitement and the joy that I do get from bringing people together. But he called me on something that I think we all need a little call up on, to show up with our true, authentic selves and to connect on a deeper level. I was talking to another entrepreneur in the city, and he said, you know, we're really needing more opportunities for meaningful connections, where we don't learn to show up, where we actually can show up just the way we are. I can show up as a 45-year-old breakdancing mama, and nobody's going to judge me. No one's going to make me feel less than. So important. You see, every single one of us in this room has one thing in common. No matter where we come from in our lives, where we come from in the world, what our ideologies are, what echo chambers we listen to, we all have one thing in common, that is to be understood. And when we're not understood, we become all kinds of ugly. We feel we have to prove ourselves, and this is what causes disconnection and disrootedness. We don't feel rooted when we have to prove our existence to ourselves and to others. I remember one of the hardest things that I went through as a human being, because at the end of the day, I have a title, but do people know my name? Everybody wants a title, but do you know your name? We all want to feel like we are valid, but really we're just showing up today at Creative Mornings as humans. Connie the human is here in front of you this morning. And I've never felt more human when I've struggled with my own mental health and my family's mental health. I have 2 boys. I have a 13-year-old, which is a mental illness all on its own. And I have a 9-year-old. 2 boys. I am the only female in my house. Somebody pray for me. And I remember when my oldest was 8, he was suicidal. At 6 years old, he was diagnosed with anxiety, depression, oppositional defiance disorder, and ADHD. We always knew that something was up. I mean, I've worked with youth for the last 20 years. I knew that this wasn't normal. And we finally got him assessed at 6 years old, but that didn't help. I mean, great, now we know that we're struggling with something, but to get help, that was hard. We knocked on doors, doors closed in our faces, and unfortunately, it took a crisis in our house to get help. And I remember taking him to the hospital because someone said, if your son is throwing fits of rage, because that's what depression looked like for him. Depression wasn't sadness, it was aggression. It was throwing things, swearing, beating down, threatening us with knives. I mean, who do you tell when your child threatens you with knives? It's not a great conversation starter. Who do you tell? Did you know that in Canada, we are only number 25 in the world for child safety? This is from a study called Raising Canada from Children's First out of the University of Calgary. We're number 25 in the world for child safety. You know what that tells me? It tells me there's a lot of brokenness that goes on behind our doors that no one is talking about. So I've decided I'll talk about it for the sake of our kids, but also for our sake, because every single one of us wants wellness and health and creativity and connection and community. And the only way we're going to get that is to have braver conversations that bring us back to rootedness. And so when I was told to take him to the hospital, we did that. We had no idea what that looked like. He was there for 3 weeks. And the psychologist brought me aside and she said, so what do you do when your son is throwing these fits of rage? I said, well, I send him to his room. And I tell him, when you're going to be a good boy, that's when you can come out. I mean, that's how I was raised. I'm from the 80s. Not only would we get sent to our room, we would get a smack upside the head while we go to our room. I thought I was being very generous. She said something so powerful to me. She said something that's changed the game in my house. The reason why my son is 13 and not suicidal, 13 and not anxious, well, okay, he's a little anxious because what 13-year-old is not full of some anxiety? But he's not where he was. We've literally experienced a miracle in our house. And it's because she said, you never send the hurting away from you. You bring them closer. And I have been wondering now, for the last 4 years, what that looks like as a community. In my house, I had to do some hard work. I remember we brought him home. He was on medication, and we had a counselor. Medication! Our life is going to be so good now, right? Isn't that just the answer? Counseling, medication, a little bit of yoga. But I want to tell you something. If counseling, medication, and yoga was good enough, we would not be in the place we're in right now as a society. I'm not against those things. My son is on medication, and so is my husband, and really I should be too. Counseling is great. Yoga is awesome. But the problem is that's the 20%. The 20%. I don't know if you've heard of this 80-20 thing, especially in fitness. I did a little personal training for a while. I know, don't I look like that? And I remember training people at the gym. You know, we're doing like 15 million squats, and then we go have pizza after. And I wonder why my ass is still so big, right? It's because the 80% is what happens on the inside, what we put on the inside of us, the rootedness inside, the foundational, hard, gritty stuff. That's the 80%. And no one can do that for you or your family except for you. No medication does that, no counseling, no yoga. Because the problem is that you do a yoga class, you're feeling all zen, and then people happen. And people are stupid. The problem is that we need to come back to what it looks like to bring people closer. And so I remember bringing him home from the hospital. His first episode of anger and rage, I felt such despair. I felt like, if that didn't work, then what will? Well, I was about to find out. So while he would throw his fit of rage, I would stay with him in the same room. And that was hard. It's so hard to be among someone who is so dysregulated, which I call going berserk, right? They're so dysregulated, and there I am sitting with him, and I would say, son, you belong in our home. We love you, and we're willing to sit with you in your mess until you feel healed and whole. I'm not trying to change your behavior. And yet in my head, I'm thinking, I just want to change your behavior. And I got to admit, I didn't really mean it at first, because I did. I wanted him to change. We want people to change. We want our workplaces to change. We want that person to change. The only person who needs to change is me. And the reason why my son's doing well is because I changed. And when I change, my environment changes and people change. And then some magic can happen. I showed up in my son's life like that, not for a week, not for a month, not for 6 months. I showed up like that for a year. And I think just showing up is the first way to get rooted in community. Just show up. Show up. And then when we show up, then what? How do we create connections that are meaningful? There's this beautiful thing called interpersonal neurobiology, which is about the fact that we highly affect one another. If you show up in the room, or let's use my experience this week on Tuesday, my coffee with my friend. When he held space for me, when he listened to my story, and he was attuned to me, my brain was rewired. That's what happens. Anxiety has no place in community where people hold space for one another. I've seen this a million times. I've seen this in a hip-hop cipher. Does anyone know what that is? The circle. You know what that is. I knew you were cool. So a hip-hop cipher, right? You got a circle, and people go in the middle, right? And they do their thing, right? So they go in, and I've done this in schools with grade 8s, which is the vortex of life. And you've got these grade 8s, and they're all looking at each other like, I don't know if I can go in the middle. But you know what? The most important part of the circle is not the person on the inside, it's the people on the outside. And the outside creates the vibe that will either create courage or anxiety. And so when you enter a room, the collective speaks. The social contagion is set by only about 3 people. And it's either going to be one of courage and creativity and collaboration that creates culture change. Could you imagine what happens when we create a room full of attunement, full of meaningful connections, where I can show up and say, I had a rough morning with my kids, but here I am. And instead of like looking at me like, why are you telling me this? I just met you. Instead, looking at my eyes and saying, I'm just so glad you're here. What would that do? What would it do if we created workplaces where people feel like they can show up and be their full creative selves? What if we were given permission to speak and use our voices and be who we are, and we weren't afraid of judgment? What would you do if you weren't afraid of being judged? And then what could we do together? I'll tell you what, society's issues are only there because we're putting up with them. But we can't just put up with them as individuals. We have to come together, because the tighter the cipher, the more energy it has. The tighter the circle, the more energy it has. And then it explodes out into our places of influence. You see, mental health is created socially. It's not created with me just in my little zen. And then I get all pissed off when people interrupt my zen. It happens when we learn how to really sit there when people are doing great and in their mess. And it was hard to sit there with my son in his mess and take his shit. It was hard. But I'll tell you what, it changed my life. And when we bring people close, they change. When we learn how to have good boundaries, when we learn your mood does not affect mine, things change. You teach people how to treat you by the boundaries you set in your life. Bringing people close doesn't mean being a doormat. That's a whole different talk. We are in a very interesting time in our city. We're in a time where people are scared. We're in a time where people are, clutching on. If you're a nonprofit, you're like, no, that's my funding. Don't take my funding. We're very afraid. And I love Paul Bourne. He is the founder of Tamarack Institute. And he talks about in times of crisis, in times when it's really tense, that's not the time to bunker down and get isolated. That's the time to come together. And it's the only thing that will make a difference. You see, when we're in the back of our brain, when we're anxious, we're not creative. We're in survival mode. But as human beings, we're not created to be in survival mode. We're actually creative. We're creators. That's what we are. That's your very identity. You are a creator. Inside of you, you have solutions. Inside of you, you have rootedness that can come out as contribution that the world needs. But when we're in survival mode, that gets shut down. And so what I'm calling Calgary to right now is a brave conversation of how do we move culture. A couple months ago, I resigned from my company, Movement with a Message, that I had done for 20 years, teaching dance in schools, teaching resilience by teaching kids and youth hip hop. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I mean, I have no real experience. I even applied at Indigo and they wouldn't take me. I'm old school, right? I printed up my resume. I went into the store. The girl looks at me, why are you here? I'm like, I'm here to drop off my resume. She's like, we don't do that. She's like, did you apply online? I'm like, yes, I applied online, but you don't want to look at my LinkedIn. I look really good on there, I said I dumbed down my resume. I used to work at Susie Shear in 97, Like, what have you been doing for all these years, right? Just been laying low. I meet the manager. He's this 24-year-old guy. He's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I'm old school. I want to shake your hand. I want to give you my resume. And they didn't hire me. And I had a moment. I had a week of not even Indigo will hire me. And then I thought, wait a minute. We are resourceful people. One of our greatest resources is people. And I called up a friend who I know has a psychological assessment for workplaces. And I said, hey, would you be willing to collaborate with me? Guess what he said? He said, I have a company that's been laying dormant now for 2 years, that I've just been waiting for the right person. You're the right person. You're hired. I'll tell you what, in times of scarcity, there's no such thing. We are so resourceful, but we can't be thinking money. We have to think, what is out there that's beyond money? And then we get creative. But again, if I would have just sat there sulking in my house about the fact that Indigo won't hire me, maybe Starbucks will, I'd be the worst barista. I would forget your order. Honestly, this is what happens when we come together. When we're rooted, when we make sense of our story, when we allow ourselves to be seen and when we show up, and then we come together in that kind of space, I'll tell you what, the world will never be the same. Thanks.